Hi everyone! Today I'll be explaining some very complicated but super cool physics stuff. By the way, this is going to be a very long presentation. Alright. So, a disclaimer. I know about like 1% of what I'm talking about, and I may get something wrong, so please take what I say with a grain of salt. Okay. I'll be explaining one of the candidates for a theory of everything. This theory is called string theory, or superstring theory. It is a definite work in progress, but a lot of the math works out nicely. There are 5 types of string theory. Type I, type IIA, type IIB, and 2 flavors of heterotic string theory. They all make sense in their own way, but in 1995, this super smart dude named Edward Witten, here he is, proposed at a string theory conference that these theories were not that different from each other, and that they actually connect through things called dualities. He proposed that they are all different limits of a single theory that unified all 5 theories together. That is called the M theory. Now, what is M theory? M theory states that the universe is made up of teeny, itty-bitty, vibrating strings. In fact, since these strings are smaller than a photon, aka what light is made up of, we'll probably never be able to see it. Before the discovery of strings, physicists used the standard model of particle physics, which includes 61 fundamental particles that make up everything in our universe. These particles include quarks, leptons, bosons, and the Higgs boson. There are also particles that carry force and antiparticles. However, that model does not explain gravity. More on that later. Alright, so the new theory is that instead of those 61 building blocks, all we have are one-dimensional vibrating strings. The different ways a string is designed affects the way it moves and vibrates, just like a string on a guitar. And the way it moves and vibrates is what creates all the different particles that make up our universe. Now, in order for the math of M theory to work out smoothly, it demands 11 dimensions. Since we can really only perceive 3 dimensions, length, width, and height, physicists speculate that these extra dimensions are either too small to observe or the laws of our universe do not enable us to ever reach these higher dimensions. Now, let's dive into what these dimensions are, and the other factors of string theory. Part 1, the 11 dimensions. Now, imagine a single point. This is a 0th dimension. It is the materialization of a possibility. Now, imagine a line between 2 of these points. Whoopsies, went over a bit. Alright, that is the 1st dimension. The 1st dimension is made up of an infinite number of 0 dimensions, or points. Now, if we put 2 of these lines together, we get the 2nd dimension, length and width. Beings that exist in the 2nd dimension are called flatlanders. If you were to point your finger towards them, they would only see a slowly approaching line, since they can only see in the 1st dimension. The 2nd dimension is like a plane, made up of an infinite number of 1st dimensions, stacked on top of each other. Alright, if we were to stack all these planes on top of each other, we'd get the 3rd dimension. So this is an example. Alright. This is where we exist. Imagining beings in the 3rd dimension is the easiest because we live in it. In the 3rd dimension, we can fold the 2nd dimension to get to a point from one point to another point with ease. This is actually the principle behind wormholes. Beings in the third dimension see only in 2 dimensions. We cannot perceive something as a sphere until we go up close and feel it. With sight alone, we see it as a circle. Everything we see is in 2D. Now, to imagine the 4th dimension, we need to throw away what we know about time. Time has more to do with the space around us and the physical world rather than ticking clock, which in short means that the time we know does not exist. The 4th dimension is made up of an infinite number of third dimensions stacked up against each other. A line in the 4th dimension could be between the time you are born and the time you die, and the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe. In the 4th dimension, we are not only bound to the present, but instead we are constantly experiencing every single moment of our lives. You could be constantly 40, constantly 25, constantly 1, and constantly dying. You, as a being in the 4th dimension, would look like a super long line of versions of yourself. Your baby self would be at one end, while you before death would be at the other end. Let's imagine the time we know to be a video we can never pause or unwind. That is what it is like in the 3rd dimension. In the 4th dimension, however, there is no such thing as time. Existence is not a flowing video, but rather an infinite amount of frames and pictures. A being in the 4th dimension can view all of these frames at once. And beyond our 3rd dimension, there is no longer flowing time. Everything is static. For our universe, or at least what we humans can perceive of it, we do have 4 dimensions. Though we can perceive the 4th dimension, our physical body is still in the 3rd dimension, meaning that we can only experience reality 1 frame at a time. Alright, the 5th dimension is if we imagine a world slightly different than ours. This world contains many similarities to our world, but slightly different events have caused the universe to split. And by different events, I mean something as simple as the position of a particle. Have you heard of Schrodinger's cat? Well, the simple version of this thought experiment is, imagine if we put a cat in a box. In 1 minute, this cat will either be dead or alive. After we've waited 1 minute, we go to check on the cat, but before we open the box, the cat exists in 2 states. The state of being alive or the state of being dead. But before we open the box and confirm whether it is dead or alive, it actually exists in both states. The concept that a particle can exist in 2 states at once is called quantum superposition. The 5th dimension is if we imagine that instead of being dead or alive, the cat is dead in one universe and alive in another universe. In one universe, the cat jumps out and saves itself. In another universe, the cat becomes a superhero. And in another universe, it becomes a Russian spy. I mean, it's whimsical to imagine, but it really starts to make sense when we grasp the fact that every single time a particle moves or changes, the universe splits into 2. The collection of all these parallel worlds is called a multiverse. A being in the 5th dimension would look like a tree composed of 4th dimensional timelines, which are composed of an infinite series of 3-dimensional physical worlds. Using our video and photo analogy again, we can imagine the 5th dimension as a video or videos that are slightly different than the one we are viewing. Now, the 6th dimension is if we imagine the ability to time travel in these parallel worlds. In the 6th dimension, we have an infinite line of 5th dimensional parallel universes stacked up against each other. If we were a being in the 6th dimension, we would be able to select any moment in time to go in any one of these universes. Imagine being able to simply step over to a world where Gordon Ramsay ran for president, but in the 1950s, or a world where you are actually a hot dog human hybrid, but way in the future. There are endless possibilities, and when I say endless, I really mean endless. In the 5th dimension, we can travel between these worlds, but in the 6th dimension, we can also time travel in these parallel timelines. It's confusing, but if we go back to the video analogy, it's like if we imagine a folder containing every frame in every video ever, and the ability to view different videos at different frames in these videos at will. Now, here we arrive at the 7th dimension. This is where it gets a little complicated, if it wasn't complicated before. The 7th dimension is if we imagine 6-dimensional branches, but with different start conditions. Instead of the Big Bang, these parallel universes could have started with an infinite amount of other conditions. If we imagine all of the 6th dimension as a single point and label it Big Bang, the 7th dimension is if we draw a line between 2 dots and we imagine all the other possible start conditions of our universe. Now, beyond this, I'm not very knowledgeable, nor do I have the brain capacity to comprehend 8, 9, and 10, but I'll try and explain what I found. Okay, so the 8th dimension is if we imagine being able to time travel in these universes that have different start conditions, meaning that we can select any moment to go into in the 7th dimension. It is another layer of freedom that builds onto the 7th dimensional space. The 8th dimension is all you really need to imagine matter. Beyond that is only speculation of different realities. Now, the 9th dimension is if we imagine universes with entirely different laws of physics, like a universe with a different value for the speed of light, or different fundamental forces, and maybe instead of particles, they have something entirely different. Maybe planets in this universe are shaped like squares instead of circles. Alright, and now, get to the 10th dimension. The 10th dimension is every single possibility imaginable, all in one dimension. So you can imagine it as all the different universes with all different laws of physics, and then all the timelines in that universe, and it's really complicated. I mean, if you imagine the 0th dimension is a single point containing nothing, and then the 10th dimension is also a single point, but it contains everything. You may ask, wait, what is the 11th dimension then? The 10th dimension encompasses all the different infinite possibilities. What could possibly go beyond that? Well, the short answer is we do not know. If we ever did figure out, we would probably still not be able to comprehend it. All of these different dimensions build up on each other. Each dimension is composed of an infinite number of the dimension below it. The first dimension is an infinity, but so is the second, and so is the third. Every dimension is an infinity, but remember that infinities can be bigger than one another. Sorry, I forgot to flip the page. Alright. Part 2, Quantum Mechanics and General Relativity. Now, I admit that I should have explained this before the dimensions, but I think the dimensions are cooler. But basically, like we've learned in class, our entire universe and everything in it is made of atoms. And these atoms have 3 parts. Protons and neutrons are in the middle, and they make up the nucleus, and electrons are buzzing outside. There are even smaller particles floating around. Some carry mass that make up matter, and while others carry the force that binds atoms together and makes things move. As we've went over before, in quantum mechanics, we have 61 fundamental particles that make up everything in the universe. Now, that's great and all, but quantum mechanics actually has no explanation for gravity. That's when general relativity comes in. Basically, the explanation is that objects with a large mass will bend the fabric of space and time around it. That curvature of space-time is what creates the effect of gravity. Now remember, in Einstein's theory of relativity, space and time are actually the same thing. Okay, right, so now we have an explanation for everything. But these two theories do not fit together. I mean, neither of them can explain black holes either. The goal of string theory is to unify these two theories or synthesize something new that will explain anything and everything about how our universe works. Currently, string theory's explanation comes in the form of a graviton. Now, what is a graviton? It's a theorized string that is not bound to our membrane because it is a closed-loop string, meaning that it can float off anywhere it wants to. A membrane is like a plane with a set amount of dimensions and physical laws. And you know that scene in Interstellar where they talk about how gravity can travel beyond dimensions? Well, there is some truth to that. In our universe, there are 4 fundamental forces. The weakest to strongest are gravity, the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and the strong nuclear force. It is puzzling why gravity is the weakest force because its pull reaches across such large distances, while the nuclear forces work only on a molecular level, and the electromagnetic force becomes stationary after the positive and negative join together to become neutral. Maybe because of the fact that gravitons are closed-looped and can travel beyond our membrane to other membranes, that it is weaker than the other forces. That's currently what some people think. And that is the extent of my knowledge on string theory. This is a super abridged version. I mean, there's so much stuff you can go into, and there's like a lot of other cool speculations people have made, like that the Big Bang is a result of 2 membranes clashing together, and that all possible membranes are floating in a 11th dimensional hyperspace with infinite amount of 10-dimensional worlds. It's existentially crippling and also very fascinating. Okay. We hope that we can one day experimentally prove string theory and use it to explain stuff like dark matter, dark energy, and the origin of and the end of the universe, and also black holes. So here are some questions I still have. Many sources state that there are 9 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, but from what we know about the 4th dimension, isn't flowing time just an illusion in our 3rd dimensional world? So what does temporal mean? My second question, many sources also say that these higher dimensions could simply be too small to see or too compact, but it'd make more sense to me for these dimensions to be inaccessible and beyond our comprehension. I don't think things could simply just enter the 8th dimension by walking through a space where it's compacted. In fact, I think that these higher dimensions would be infinitely bigger than our 3D universe. What is the 11th dimension? Can we really go beyond the 10th? My 4th question is, what constitutes the beginning of the universe? Like, there must have been some instability of nothingness that triggered the Big Bang. If so, how is that instability not the beginning of the 6th dimensional timeline? Like, where do these timelines start and how do they end? The 5th question is, knowing all of this, like, how did our reality come to fruition? Who or what made all of this? The 6th question is, can beings like us exist in any other dimension? Or rather, could life exist in any other dimension but the 3rd? And the 7th question is, if the universe is made up of 1-dimensional strings, then there must also be 0-dimensional points that make up those strings. If that's the case, can we find out even more if we applied that to our equations? We could call it the dot theory. Alright, and that is the end of this very long presentation. I hope some cool facts prevented you from falling asleep, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye!